The first time I saw her, she was walking through a whiteout, a small, heavy-set girl pushing against a blizzard like she had something worth proving to God himself. Snow stung her face, her lantern shook in her hand, and every few steps, she'd stop, like she needed to remember why she kept going. But she didn't turn back, not even when the wind howled hard enough to take the breath from a stronger woman, not even when the world seemed dead set on breaking her. Folks in Pine Hollow used to laugh at Clara Mayfield, said she was slow, said she was soft, said she was built for ridicule and chores, nothing more. But that morning, watching her step through the storm, toward a ranch no one dared set foot on, I realized something the town never did. Sometimes the people you call a joke are the only ones strong enough to stand when the world turns cruel. And this story, it's about a girl they tried to throw away and a man who refused to let her be thrown. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe now. Let's begin. The night wind pressed against Pine Hollow like a tired animal scratching at the walls, dragging loose snow across the frozen boardwalks and rattling every loose shutter in town. Inside, Mrs. Granger's sewing house. The cold barely stayed outside. Heat from the potbelly stove pooled low around the women's boots, but the air above it carried the sharp bite of winter and that restless sound of gossip that never quite died in places like this. Someone let out a shrill laugh. Another chimed in. Needles clicked against cloth, scissors snapped, and the flames in the stove hissed under the weight of damp coal. In the corner, where the lamplight dimmed and the shadows felt heavier, sat Clara Mayfield Short, broad in the hips and shoulders, her left foot turning inward each time she shifted on the worn stool. She worked quietly, 2 fingers guiding a small silver needle through a torn hem. The thread pulled smooth and steady the way she'd done since she was a girl. She didn't look up. She rarely did. Looking up invited eyes, and eyes invited judgment. Lord help that chair, one of the girls whispered, loud enough for the whole table. More laughter. Clara kept stitching. Another voice joined in, Ruthie Hartwell, the tallest and meanest of the bunch, always quick with a smile when Mrs. Granger looked her way, always quicker with a jab when the door closed behind the matron. She waved a piece of paper above her head. Look what I found on the wall outside the mercantile. The girls gathered around her like birds, pecking at something shiny. Clara kept her gaze down, though her ears tilted toward them. Help needed. Ruthie read dramatically, barn repair, fair pay, Dry Creek Ranch, a chorus of gasps, mocking and amused. Oh, that's rich, another girl said. Elias Boone. And that stone-hearted mule I heard, he fired a blacksmith for coughing too loud. No, no. A third girl interrupted. I heard he hasn't spoken a full sentence to anyone in 4 years. And he's still got that wild bull he keeps near the north fence. Tore a man's coat clean off with one swing. He lives like a hermit, Ruthie added. A broken-down cabin, a barn full of busted boards, and a temper like barbed wire. The girls shivered theatrically, then laughed at their own foolishness. Then, as if pulled by some cruel, invisible string, every head turned toward Clara. She felt it before she saw it, the weight of their stares pressing into her shoulders. She tried to make her fingers move faster, to disappear into the cloth the way she always did, sewing herself into silence. Clara, Ruthie crooned, stepping closer. Your hands aren't busy tomorrow, are they? Clara's throat tightened. She shook her head once. Perfect. You can take this job. A small, stunned breath escaped her. I don't. You mend fabric. Ruthie cut in smoothly. How much harder could a barn be? More giggles. Clara's cheeks burned, her ears ringing. Someone added, might even be the only thing strong enough to hold her weight. A wave of laughter washed through the room. Clara lowered her face, wishing she could vanish between the stitches. Ruthie dropped the notice onto Clara's lap. You leave at dawn. Elias Boone needs help, and we're doing the town a favor by sending you. Clara tried again. But the storm, I shouldn't. Ruthie leaned down, breath warm and sour. Turn it down, she whispered, and you'll sleep outside. We don't feed freeloaders. A cold fist closed around Clara's ribs. She had nowhere else, no kin, no home but this drafty attic above the sewing room, and even that was granted, out of pity and hard work. The girls moved on to another joke, another story, forgetting her as quickly as they'd mocked her. That was how it always went. Their cruelty was sharp, but their attention span was short. Clara folded the notice, smoothed the creases, and tucked it into her apron pocket. She finished the hem she'd been working on, tied off the thread neatly, then slipped upstairs to the narrow room under the roof. The attic was colder than outside. She lit a small lamp and sat on her cot, clutching the mismatched gloves she'd sewn from leftover scraps. One glove was brown, the other navy blue. She'd made them years ago, when she still believed winter meant warm fires and people who cared enough to share wood. The wind moaned against the shingles. She whispered into her palms, I'll be all right. Just one day. Just one day. But even she didn't believe the words. She slept little. Dawn came gray and bitter, frost glazing the window like a sheet of cracked glass. The sewing house was silent as a church when she crept downstairs. Careful not to wake anyone. She didn't want witnesses. She didn't want their smirks. She tied a scarf around her neck, slipped on her uneven gloves, and lifted a small lantern from the hook by the door. Outside, the storm hadn't fully passed. Snow drifted ankle-deep, swirling under the early light, every gust stinging her face as though the wind itself questioned what she was doing. Clara stepped into the cold anyway. Each footstep left a deep print, the limp in her left leg making the trail crooked behind her. The lantern flame trembled in the wind, its glow a tiny heartbeat against the white world ahead. Somewhere out there, past the frozen road and through the quiet miles, waited a ranch, owned by a man who spoke to no one, whose temper was legend, whose barn was said to swallow grown men whole, and they were sending her Clara Mayfield, heavy, limping, never quite enough of anything straight into it for a laugh. She pulled her coat tighter and walked on. The storm swallowed her within minutes. Her breath turned to tiny clouds, her hands numbed through the mismatched gloves. But she kept going. A small figure pushing through winter toward a place she'd never been, toward a man she'd only heard nightmares about, toward a fate that was no longer a joke, not to her, and far behind her, Pine Hollow slept warm while she disappeared into the white. The storm eased by mid-morning, leaving the world hushed and pale under a sky the color of old tin. Clara's boots were soaked through before she'd gone a mile. The snow clung to her skirts like stubborn hands, pulling her back with each step, and the cold seemed to seep through the seams of her bones. Her breath drifted ahead of her in brittle clouds. Each inhale felt thin, each exhale heavier than the last. The road to Dry Creek Ranch wasn't really a road at all, just two shallow tracks, carved through snow and earth by wagon wheels long gone. No houses, no lanterns burning in windows. Just endless white, and the crunch of her boots breaking the silence that swallowed the land whole. Every so often, a crow, perched on a fence post, watched her pass, its feathers puffed up against the cold, black eyes following her as though it knew she didn't belong here. She kept her gaze low, head bent into the wind. Her fingers ached inside the mismatched gloves. She imagined the sewing house far behind her, the warmth, the stove, even the cruel laughter. It all felt like another life. After what felt like hours, the land shifted. The hills seemed to sag open, revealing a lonely stretch of plain. And there, small at first, then taking shape as she neared, stood Dry Creek Ranch. If the sewing house had been cruel, this place felt indifferent. A weather-beaten cabin crouched against the wind, its roof patched in places with tin. The barn stood farther off, its doors hanging crooked, snow piled against its lower boards. A corral leaned like it was tired of standing, rails warped by seasons of sun and storm. It was a ranch, clinging to life, through sheer, stubborn will, much like the man who owned it. Clara stopped at the edge of the clearing, breath-catching. She'd never seen such loneliness, made into a home. No smoke rose from the chimney, no horses moved in the pasture. Even the wind sounded different here, whispering close to the ground as if out of respect. Then she heard it. Clang. A pause. Clang. Metal striking wood with the rhythm of someone who wasn't working so much as wrestling with whatever kept him awake at night. She followed the sound until she came upon the broken gate. A large man knelt beside it, hammer in hand, shoulders broad beneath a worn wool shirt, sleeves rolled past his elbows, despite the cold. His hair, dark and uncombed, fell near his brow, and steam rose from his breath as he drove a nail into the splintered frame. Clang. He didn't so much as glance her way. Clara swallowed, her throat dry. This must be him, Elias Boone, the man who hadn't smiled since the winter his wife died, the man who'd once thrown a hammer at a blacksmith for talking too much, the man whose silence was a warning in itself. She took one hesitant step toward him. Snow crunched. The sound snapped his attention up, his eyes pale gray, colder than the morning fixed on her. Clara nearly stepped back, but her feet stayed rooted in place, as if the cold had finally claimed them. He rose slowly, towering over the broken gate and over her. The hammer hung loose in his grip. "What do you want?" His voice carried the rough scrape of someone who didn't use it often. Clara's lips parted, but no words came out at first. Her breath fogged between them, drifting like smoke. I was sent, she managed, to help, with the barn, with repairs. He stared at her as though he could see every lie she'd never told, every shame she carried. "Who sent you the sewing house?" she whispered. They said you needed an extra pair of hands." The corner of his mouth twitched, not in amusement, more like a man stung by something sharp and familiar. His eyes dropped to her soaked boots, her shaking hands, the lantern she still clutched, though daylight had already taken the sky. "They sent you?" he said slowly. It wasn't a question. Clara felt heat rise into her cheeks, despite the cold. Elias exhaled once, a short, humorless sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a curse, something in between. "You came all this way," he said, "in this weather, for a job you don't even want." She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. I need work. Any work." He studied her in a silence so deep she heard the wind shift across the snow behind her. His gaze wasn't cruel. It wasn't soft either. It was the gaze of a man who had learned the world's worst truths early and never forgot them. "Go home," he said finally, voice low and flat. "This isn't work for you." Clara's heart lurched. She should have turned around. She should have nodded and trudged back through the cold toward Pine Hollow and its laughter waiting like a blade. But she didn't move. Her fingers trembled at her sides. Her breath puffed weakly into the air. The snow stung her eyes, and still she stayed. Elias frowned. "Did you hear me?" Clara forced the words out, small but steady. "Sir, I need the work." The wind swept between them then, carrying her words into the gray distance, as if deciding their fate. Elias Boone stood silent for a long, heavy moment, the hammer still in his fist, his jaw tightening like he was fighting off something he didn't want to feel. Then he jerked his head toward the barn, without a word more, and Clara cold, exhausted, and more afraid than she'd ever been, followed. The snow closed behind them, erasing her tracks. The barn groaned in the wind like an old beast refusing to lie down. Its boards rattled, its rafters shuddered, and the cold inside bit harder than the cold outside. Clara stepped through the half-hanging doors and paused, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light spilling through gaps in the walls. Chaos greeted her. Broken planks lay scattered across the dirt floor. Patches of frozen mud clung to everything: buckets, posts, the lower beams of the stalls. A saddle sat overturned in a corner, its leather cracked and stiff from long neglect. Tack hung in tangled heaps, some straps snapped clean through. Frost shimmered on the rafters, a thin white crust that drifted down whenever the wind pushed too hard. Clara wrapped her arms around herself for a moment, taking it all in. This wasn't a barn. It was a storm shelter, holding the ruins of someone's life. Behind her. Elias spoke without looking back. "Start where you like. Everything needs doing." He strode away toward the corral, boots crunching through snow. Clara listened until the sound faded, then let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She set her lantern down and began. The first task was simple: clear the floor. She used a rough, splintering broom, pushing matted hay and frozen clumps of earth into piles. But the wind kept blowing through the gaps in the boards, undoing her progress with every gust. The cold seeped into her fingers despite the gloves. Her limp slowed her, every step a small negotiation with pain. Still, she kept going. She lifted fallen planks, stacked them by size, ignoring how her back strained with each bend. She scraped ice from the stall doors with the side of a rusted shovel. She swept, wiped, tugged, straightened her breath coming in small, sharp bursts. Each movement felt like stitching a torn seam, one frayed edge at a time. After a long while, she reached the mound of tangled tack. Kneeling in the dirt, she sorted through the straps. Some were beyond saving. Others just needed patience. She found a rein strap cracked near the buckle. She touched it gently, as if it were wounded skin. Leather could be mended if handled with respect. She pulled her sewing kit from her apron, a small pouch of needles and thick thread she always carried. Working slowly, she pressed the edges together and began stitching them with short, even passes. Her fingers steadied, despite the cold. This, at least, felt familiar. This was something she knew how to fix. She didn't hear Elias approach, only sensed him, like the cold shifting. When she glanced up, he stood in the doorway, watching. His arms crossed over his chest, expression unreadable, eyes flicking from the strap in her hand to the piles she'd already cleared. He didn't speak. Clara dropped her gaze, heat rising to her cheeks. She didn't want praise. She didn't expect any. She just didn't want him thinking she was useless. Elias stepped away without a word, leaving only the sound of boots on snow. She exhaled slowly and returned to her stitches. Hours passed. The light shifted from gray to the pale gold of a sun fighting through clouds. Her breath fogged thicker as sweat cooled on her skin. Her hands ached. The blisters came first small hot points along her palms. Then the skin split. A thin line of red stained her gloves. She hissed softly, peeled the gloves off, and tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her underskirt. She wrapped it around her palm and tied a tight knot to hold it in place. Strong hands. Mrs. Granger once sneered, but no brains. Clara shook the memory away and kept working. The wind pushed harder through the boards, tossing her hair loose. A stray piece whipped across her face. She brushed it aside and bent to lift a heavy bucket, frozen solid at the bottom. Pain shot up her side, and for a moment she wavered, knees trembling. She steadied herself against a stall post, breath catching. The room spun just a little, not enough to fall, not enough to stop. But Elias saw. He must have doubled back without her hearing, because suddenly the barn door creaked, and he stood there again. This time his eyes were sharper, catching the tremble in her legs, the blood seeping through the cloth around her hand, the sheen of sweat on her brow despite the cold. Clara straightened so quickly she swayed. He grunted an unclear sound, disappointment or something else, and stepped inside. Without a word, he set a tin cup on a clean section of rail. Steam curled from it, faint but unmistakable. "Drink," he said. Clara blinked. I'm fine. You're no use to me on the ground." His tone wasn't cruel, not gentle either, just a man stating a fact, the way a man might speak of weather or cattle. Clara reached for the cup with both hands. The heat shocked her fingers first, then spread slowly through her palms, her wrists, up her arms. Warm water, nothing more, nothing less. But it felt like a kindness, so unexpected she had to look away. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias didn't acknowledge the words. He tugged a loose nail from the wall and tossed it into a bucket. But Clara saw something, just a flicker as he turned, a glance back, quick, almost hidden, as if he wasn't checking on her, so much as checking the space between them. It disappeared as fast as it came. He left again, boots crunching in the snow. The barn seemed larger after he stepped out, the cold sharper, but the cup in her hands stayed warm. Clara stood there, letting the heat settle into her bones, letting the trembling slow. Outside, the wind shifted. The boards creaked. Somewhere in the distance, the gate Elias had been fixing groaned under its own weight. Clara tightened the cloth around her hand, set the cup aside, and picked up the broom again. The barn wasn't finished, not yet, and neither was she. By late afternoon, the storm clouds had thinned, letting the weak winter sun pour through the gaps in the barn boards like pale ribbons. Clara rested her broom against the stall post, rolling her stiff shoulders. The warmth of the tin cup still lingered in her hands, though the drink had long been finished. Outside, Elias worked the fence line, his silhouette cutting across the snow. He moved the way men moved after too many years alone, slow, heavy, with a kind of stubborn silence that weighed down the air around him. Clara stepped out of the barn to empty a bucket of frozen hay scraps. The cold hit her full in the face, sharper than before. She dumped the bucket by the compost pile, then froze. Something moved at the edge of her vision. Not wind, not shadow. Movement behind the cabin door. A small figure, Clara blinked, thinking the cold played tricks on her eyes. But then the door cracked open just an inch, and she saw him clearly this time. A boy, no older than 7, maybe 8, thin as winter reeds, wrapped in a wool shirt 2 sizes too big. His eyes wide, watchful. The blue of new ice stared straight at her. Clara's breath caught. The boy didn't speak, didn't blink, just stood there, half hidden behind the frame, studying her like she was something fragile. The world hadn't yet broken. She opened her mouth to say hello, but before a sound came out, the boy vanished into the shadows, the door clicking shut behind him. Clara turned, half expecting Elias to be standing behind her, ready to explain, but he was yards away, hammering a board back into place with the same grim patience he carried through everything. She didn't call out to him. She didn't ask. Somehow, it didn't feel like her place. Clara returned to the barn and worked until the sun dipped low behind the hills. By the time Elias called it quits, the light had faded into a muted purple that softened the harsh edges of the world. "You can sleep in the loft tonight," he said, jerking his chin toward the barn. "If you head back to town now, you'll freeze." She nodded, surprised but grateful. He didn't wait for her answer, just turned toward the cabin, shoulders hunched against the cold. As he opened the door, Clara felt the boy's gaze again, soft, curious, a little scared. The door closed. Clara lingered in the snow, staring at the place where the boy had stood. She didn't understand why he was here, why Elias, the man who barely tolerated another soul, would keep a child hidden away in this wind-beaten cabin. She thought of the small sewing kit in her pocket, the needles, the leftover scraps of wool she often used to patch her own mittens. An idea tugged gently at her. Inside the barn, she sat on a bale of hay and pulled the scraps from her apron. With careful stitches, she shaped a tiny mitten small enough for the hand she'd glimpsed, lined with the softest fabric she had. She didn't know if the boy would take it. She didn't know if Elias would be angry, but she knew cold, and she knew loneliness. At the cabin door, Clara hesitated only a moment before placing the little mitten on the step right beside the boot scraper and returning to the barn without a sound. She climbed the ladder to the hayloft, curling into a nest of blankets Elias had left there long ago. The barn creaked under the weight of the wind. The horses huffed softly in their stalls. She lay awake longer than she planned, listening, thinking, wondering who the boy was, and why Elias said nothing. Morning came slow and gray. Clara descended the ladder, her limbs stiff from the cold. She stepped outside to begin her chores, boots crunching through fresh snow. Halfway to the barn door, she glanced toward the cabin. The mitten was gone. Her breath warmed the air in front of her as a small, unexpected smile touched her lips. She turned back to her work, but the day didn't pass without another glimpse. Near midday, while sweeping the last of the frost from the rafters, Clara heard a faint creak. She looked down. There, standing just inside the barn doors, was the boy. He didn't speak. He didn't come closer. He only raised one hand. The mitten, her mitten covered it perfectly. The breath slipped out of Clara's lungs all at once. So soft, so warm, so unexpected. She smiled at him, a small smile, careful not to scare him off. The boy's eyes widened, and for a heartbeat she thought he might smile back. But then footsteps crunched outside. Elias. The boy darted behind a post, vanishing into shadows as fast as he'd arrived. Elias stepped inside and saw Clara watching the dark corner where the boy had disappeared. His jaw tightened, not with anger, just something heavier, old, protective. He didn't ask what the boy had done. He didn't tell her who he was. He simply nodded toward the bucket by the stall. You missed a spot. But his eyes, when they flicked briefly toward her stitched mitten, softened just enough for Clara to wonder what story lived behind the door she'd never been meant to open, and why the silence between them suddenly felt like the beginning of something fragile, something real, something neither of them yet had the courage to name. The morning wind carried a different sound, one Clara hadn't heard since she left Pine Hollow. Hoofbeats, 3 sets, steady and careless, like men riding, not with purpose, but with mischief in their reins. Clara stiffened inside the barn. She instinctively pulled her shoulders inward, as if trying to hide herself behind the broom she held. Through a gap in the boards, she saw them appear at the far edge of the ranch. 3 riders cutting across the snow, their horses tossing clouds of frost with each step. Lyle Carter, Brent Sawyer, and Sawyer Pike boys who had aged into men without ever losing the cruelty of their youth. Clara recognized them instantly, even from a distance, the way they sat in the saddle, lazy-like, the way they laughed before even reaching the barn. She felt her insides fold in on themselves. When the men reached the fence line, they dismounted in a scatter of boots, spurs jangling. Lyle, the tallest, spat into the snow as he took in the sight of Clara sweeping the barn threshold. Well, damn, he drawled. Didn't know Boone was higher in circus stock these days. Brent barked a laugh. Look at her girls, built sturdier than the barn itself. Sawyer snorted. Careful, sweetheart. Floor might give under you. Wouldn't want you falling through and cracking this whole ranch in half. Their voices hit her like cold stones. Clara's fingers tightened around the broom handle. She kept her head low, her breath shallow. She wished she could sink into the dirt beneath her feet. Lyle walked closer, tapping her broom with the toe of his boot. What's Boone paying you? By the pound. Brent wheezed with laughter, slapping his knee. She might eat better here than at the sewing house. Boone best watch his pantry. Clara's vision blurred. She blinked fast, swallowing the sting in her throat. Then a small sound came from behind the barn door. Soft, almost a whimper, the boy watching from shadows. Clara turned slightly, just enough to see his thin frame pressed against the stall gate, eyes wide with worry. Lyle noticed. Well, I'll be damned, he said. Didn't know Boone kept a runt around. Sawyer chuckled. Kid looks like he ain't said a word in his life. He's mute, Brent added with a grin. Mute and useless, just like he didn't finish. Because the barn door swung open so hard the hinges screeched, and Elias Boone stepped out like a storm, with legs. His eyes found Clara first shaking, pale, trying to stand still despite the hurt in her breathing. Then they found the boy cowering, then the cowboys. The air shifted. Elias didn't yell, didn't raise his hand. He simply strode across the snow with a steady, dangerous calm. You boys lost, he asked. Voice low and even. Lyle gave a mocking bow. Just stopping by to say hello. Friendly neighbor thing. Elias's jaw tightened, the muscle ticking once. You've got 10 seconds to ride out. Sawyer scoffed. Since when do you give orders? Boone, last we heard, you couldn't keep a hired hand for more than a day. Brent laughed. Makes sense he's hiring this one. Though, girl like her don't got anywhere else. He didn't finish either. Elias moved so fast, Brent flinched backward in surprise. One moment, he was standing 3 paces away. The next, he had a fistful of Lyle's coat front and lifted him clean off the ground. Snow fell from Lyle's boots as he dangled, sputtering. Elias's voice stayed calm, too calm. You open your mouth about her again, he said. and I'll close it for you. Lyle's eyes went wide. Put me down. Boone. Elias didn't. He pulled Lyle in closer, nose to nose. 10 seconds. And that's the only grace you're gettin'. Brent paled. Sawyer swore under his breath. Elias released Lyle, who stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own boots. None of them laughed now. None of them even looked at Clara. They scrambled toward their horses, like men chased by something they couldn't see but could feel in their bones. When they mounted, Elias didn't flinch, didn't move, just stared them down until the last hat vanished over the hill. The day fell quiet again. Clara let out the breath she'd been holding, her hands trembling hard enough that she dropped the broom. It clattered to the floor. She bent quickly to pick it up, cheeks hot with embarrassment. Elias didn't mock her, didn't lecture her. He just stood there, breathing hard, his jaw still tight. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, voice barely audible. He looked at her, then not the quick glance he usually gave, but a long, steady look that felt like a hand closing gently around something fragile. "Yes," he said. "I did." Clara opened her mouth, but no words came. Elias's gaze flicked to her shaking hands. He took one step closer, then stopped, as if unsure what came next. Behind them, the boy peeked from the stall, mitten-covered hand clutching the beam. His eyes flickered between Clara and Elias, as though trying to read their faces. Elias cleared his throat and turned slightly away. "You should take a minute," he muttered. "Get your breath." Clara nodded, even though her breath wasn't what she needed. What she needed was to understand why this man who spoke to no one, trusted no one, had stepped between her and danger with the kind of force a man saves for people he cannot bear to lose. But she didn't ask, and he didn't explain. The cold wind swept between them, carrying the last echo of the cowboy's hoofbeats into the distance. And Clara, standing in the doorway of a barn she hadn't meant to belong to, felt something shift deep inside her chest, quiet, unsure, trembling like a lantern in winter wind. Night came early in that part of Wyoming. The wind hit the barn walls with long, low moans, slipping through every crack the day's work hadn't fixed. Clara lit a lantern and hung it on a nail near the rafters, its warm glow settling over the tools, the straw, and the half-repaired tack she'd stacked neatly in the corner. Elias sat at the workbench, a whetstone in one hand, a dull chisel in the other. He moved slow, almost rhythmic, the scrape of metal against stone joining the song of the wind. For the first time since she'd arrived, the silence felt warm instead of heavy. Clara worked at a broken halter strap, the needle passing through leather with slow, even stitches. Her hands still stung from the day's bruises, but pain had become a familiar thing, easier to manage than people. Jonah, the small boy, slept somewhere in the cabin beyond the barn wall. She hadn't seen him since the cowboys left, but she felt his presence the way one feels the warmth of a fire hidden behind a door. Elias spoke first. "Jonah likes to hide in the loft," he said, without looking up. "If he ever comes in while you're working, don't worry. He won't cause trouble." Clara paused mid-stitch. "He seems sweet," she said softly. Elias grunted, though not unkindly. "He don't say much." She hesitated. "Does he speak at all?" Elias set the chisel down. "The whetstone, too." He leaned his elbows on his knees, staring at the floorboards as though reading something written only he could see. "No," he said. "Ain't spoken since he was 3. The wind pressed against the barn again, rattling a loose plank. Clara waited. She wasn't sure he would say more, but he did. He ain't mine, Elias added quietly. Clara felt something in the room shift. She folded the strap across her lap, listening. His daddy was named Harlan Pike, Elias continued. Good man. Better man than me. He worked this land with me for 6 years. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, the lantern light catching the deep grooves by his mouth. The blizzard of '83 hit early, Elias went on, caught us up near the ridge while we were bringing the cattle down. Snow came so fast it swallowed the sky. Couldn't see my own damn hand in front of me. Clara's fingers tightened around the leather. We tied ourselves together with a rope to keep from losing each other. But the wind, Elias's voice dropped. The wind tore us apart, dragged me straight toward the drop. Would have gone over if Harlan hadn't cut the rope. He swallowed hard, the motion thick in his throat. He gave me his last chance. Not many men would do that. Clara's breath caught. I'm so sorry. Elias shook his head. He knew what he was doing. That's the kind of man he was. A pause, heavy as snow on a roof. His body didn't turn up until spring. Clara looked toward the cabin where Jonah slept. And Jonah didn't have no one else, Elias said. His ma died birthing him. That left Harlan. Then, just him. His eyes lifted to hers, tired eyes, hard eyes, softened by something he'd tried too long to bury. I owed Harlan, Elias murmured. So I took the boy, figured I'd raise him right, but I ain't done a good job paying that debt. Clara shook her head. You're keeping him warm, fed, safe. That's a debt paid every day. Elias looked away. You don't know what I'm like. I know enough, she said gently. He huffed something like a laugh low, rough, almost ashamed. You've seen me swing a hammer at a fence post because the boards didn't fit. I've also seen you hand me warm water, she said, when I could barely stand. Elias fell silent again. The lantern flickered, throwing long shadows across the walls. Clara felt her heartbeat soften, felt the barn settle around them, as though listening. He likes the mitten, Elias said suddenly. Jonah? Clara blinked. You saw him wearing it. Elias nodded once, had a death grip on it this morning, like someone might take it. Clara lowered her gaze, hiding the warmth rising in her chest. I just didn't want him cold. He's been cold most of his life, Elias murmured. She didn't mean to speak this next part aloud, but it slipped out anyway. Quiet as a breath, so have I. Elias turned, really turned, his full attention on her for the first time that night. Clara stared down at her scarred hands. Girls in town, people in town, they've been mocking me since before I could spell my own name. My size, my limp, my face, everything. Her voice wavered. Most days I don't know if they hate me more or just don't see me at all. Elias's brow furrowed, not with pity, something deeper. I learned sewing because no one wanted me in their house. She went on. They said I was too slow, too heavy, too much. She let out a shaky breath. Cheap labor, that's all I ever was. Elias's jaw tightened. They were wrong. Clara blinked. You don't even know me. I know enough. He echoed her words from moments earlier. I know you walked through a blizzard for work that ain't worth half the trouble. I know you cleaned a barn most men refuse to set foot in. I know you stitched leather with hands bleeding through cloth. His voice dipped lower. And I know you gave a boy you don't know a mitten without wantin' thanks. Clara swallowed hard. Elias looked toward the dark loft, where Jonah sometimes hid. People like them don't understand people like you. Like us, Clara whispered before she could stop herself. Their eyes met steady, searching, something raw flickering between them. Elias didn't speak. He didn't look away. For a moment, the howling wind felt far, far off. The barn felt warm, the lantern brighter, the world smaller and safer than either of them had known in years. Clara bowed her head to her work again, though her fingers trembled in a way that had nothing to do with cold. Elias picked up the whetstone but didn't resume sharpening. The silence between them, once empty, now felt full. Full of something neither dared to name, not yet. Word traveled fast in towns like Pine Hollow, faster than horses, faster than telegrams, faster than truth. Clara had only been at the ranch a handful of days, yet by the end of the week, the town had already built a full-blown story around her. Boone's keeping that big girl in his barn, someone murmured near the potbelly stove at the general store. No, another corrected. She's sleeping in his cabin. I heard it from Ruthie Hartwell's cousin, who heard it from her aunt's boy, practically living with him. A third voice chimed in, low and suspicious. Maybe she's after his land. The men laughed. The women pretended not to. Clara stood on the far side of the store, holding a sack of flour against her chest like a shield. She hadn't come to listen. She'd only needed supplies, salt, flour, and a bit of sugar if she could stretch her coins far enough. But the moment she stepped inside, she'd felt the stares, felt the air turn heavy, felt the whispers tighten around her like a rope. She kept her eyes down, pretending she didn't hear them, pretending the words didn't crawl under her skin like thorns. But one voice, sharp and mocking, cut through the wall she tried to build. What's Boone think he's doing taking in a girl built like that? Another answered, he ain't thinking. Men like him don't think straight round a woman. Even one Clara didn't stay long enough to hear the end. She set her coins on the counter with shaking fingers, grabbed her small bundle of goods, and left before the shopkeeper could count back her change. The cold outside hit her like a slap, but she welcomed it. It was honest, unforgiving, but honest. She hugged the flour sack close and walked quickly toward the road leading out of town. Behind her, laughter spilled out of the store. The wind carried it, and it carried her shame with it. Elias heard the rumors long before Clara returned. He'd gone to the blacksmith to trade for nails, only to find 3 men leaning against the wall, talking loud enough for him to hear. Girl's making herself real cozy out there. Boone must be desperate. Bet she's thinking Elias didn't let them finish. He walked right past, with his jaw set and shoulders rigid, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But inside, something old and ugly stirred something he'd fought for years to keep buried. Anger, hot, fast, familiar, the kind that made a man forget himself. He gripped the nails so tightly his knuckles turned white. For a moment, he felt the old urge, the one that lived in his father's fists, to shut them up, to break something, to prove something, but he wasn't his father. He forced himself to breathe, forced his hands to unclench, forced the heat in his chest to cool enough so he could mount his horse and ride home without hurting anyone. The road back to Dry Creek Ranch felt longer that day, lined with shadows, shaped like memories he didn't want. Elias Boone rode in silence, but his jaw stayed tight the whole way. Clara was already back when he arrived. She stood outside the barn, setting down the sack of flour with slow, careful movements. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes were red. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He knew. She looked at him once, just once, and he could see it all: the hurt, the shame, the exhaustion of being judged by a world that never gave her a chance. She began, but her voice cracked. Elias dismounted, boots hitting the snow with a muted thud. "You don't have to say it," he said quietly. But Clara shook her head. "People think I don't care what people think." His voice came out sharper than he meant. She recoiled slightly, and he hated himself for it. He lowered his tone. "Clara, you're safe here." The words hung between them. Not a promise, not a comfort, just truth, spoken by a man who didn't speak more than he had to. Clara nodded, though the tightness in her throat didn't ease. She picked up the flower and walked into the cabin, her limp more pronounced than usual. Elias followed at a distance, fighting the urge to kick the door closed hard enough to shake the walls. Not because he was angry at her, but because he was furious at himself for letting her walk into a town that fed on cruelty. Night wrapped the ranch in quiet. Inside the cabin, the fire cracked softly, throwing warm light across the wooden floor. Clara sat on the rug, her back against the side of the armchair, mending a tear in her skirt. She worked, slower than usual, fingers still trembling from the day. Elias sat on the hearth nearby, poking the fire with a stick. The flames danced in the reflection of his eyes. He didn't speak. Not because he didn't want to, but because anger still simmered beneath his ribs, an ember he didn't trust yet. Jonah padded into the room, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He saw Clara and crossed the floor on quiet feet. Without hesitation, he crawled into her lap and curled up like a small winter animal seeking shelter. Clara froze for a heartbeat. Then she shifted her skirt and wrapped an arm around him gently, careful not to frighten him. Jonah tucked his hand, the one wearing her mitten, against her side and closed his eyes. The mending thread slipped from Clara's fingers, forgotten. Elias looked up. He watched them longer than he should have. The boy he'd raised but never reached. The woman who'd crossed a blizzard just to be mocked again. Two souls pressed together by need more than choice. And him sitting on the far side of the fire, unsure where he fit in any of it. Clara stroked Jonah's hair. Once, slow and protective, Jonah relaxed deeper into her. Elias swallowed hard. Something in his chest pulled tight. He looked away quickly, staring into the flames until his vision blurred. But even when he turned his face from them, he could still feel the warmth that had settled in the room, a warmth the winter wind outside could not touch. The wind hit the ranch just after sundown, sharp, sudden, and violent enough to rattle the windows in their frames. Clara had just finished sweeping the last of the day's dust from the kitchen floor when the cabin creaked like a ship caught in the wrong tide. The air temperature dropped in a blink. Even the fire in the stove hissed, shrinking back as if afraid of what waited outside. Elias moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. "Windstorm's comin' in fast," he muttered. "Shouldn't last long, but it'll be mean." Clara wrapped her arms around herself. She could hear it already, an icy howl rolling across the plains, gathering speed. Jonah sat on the rug, pushing his little wooden horse across the boards, unaware of the storm sharpening its teeth. Then the night snapped. A boom so loud, Clara jumped echoed from the direction of the barn. Elias's head whipped toward the door. "That'll be the barn door," he said under his breath. "Latch must have given..." He grabbed his coat and stepped outside to secure it, the wind nearly ripping the door from his grip as he left. Clara knelt beside Jonah. "Stay close to the fire, sweetheart," she whispered. Jonah nodded, hugging the wooden horse to his chest. But less than a minute later, the wind surged again, harder, louder, and the cabin door groaned against its hinges. Clara glanced to the rug. Jonah was gone. The wooden horse lay on its side, her breath caught, sharp and cold. She hurried to the window, squinting into the darkness. Snow whipped across the yard in frantic circles, nothing visible beyond the steps. Panic pricked her skin. "Jonah," she called, voice trembling. Another gust answered, then barely audible beneath the storm, she heard it. Tiny footsteps, running, headed toward the barn. "No," she whispered. "Oh God, no." Clara threw on her shawl, grabbed a lantern, and burst into the storm. The wind hit her like a wall. Snow sliced her cheeks raw. Her limp made each step fight against the drag of the ground, but she pushed forward, teeth clenched against the cold. She saw small prints, already half filled by drifting snow leading past the barn, toward the creek. Her heart hammered. "Jonah," she shouted, voice ripped apart by the gale. The storm swallowed his name whole. She stumbled down the slope toward the creek, her lantern flickering wildly. Her breath burned her lungs. The snow came sideways, stealing her vision in fleeting bursts. Then she heard it, a faint, terrified whimper. Clara followed the sound, like a rope through darkness. "Jonah, Jonah, baby, where are you?" She spotted him near the frozen creek bank, crouched low, clutching something in his tiny hands, the toy horse. The wind had shoved him nearly to the edge. One wrong step, and he'd go tumbling down the iced-over drop. "Oh, sweetheart." Clara choked. She reached him, dropping to her knees in the snow. Jonah clung to the toy, trembling violently. His eyes, those winter blue eyes, were wide with fear. The wind roared again, knocking Clara sideways. She wrapped her arms around Jonah's small body, shielding him with her own, pulling him close so he could feel her warmth, her steadiness. "I've got you," she whispered into his hair, though the storm stole half the words. "I won't let go. Not ever." Jonah buried his face against her. Clara forced herself upright, cradling him against her chest. The climb back up the slope felt impossible. The cold gnawed at her legs. Her bad foot slipped on ice. Her lungs screamed for air. But Jonah clutched her tighter, and that alone became reason enough to push. Step by step, she fought her way through the storm. Halfway across the yard, the lantern blew out, plunging them into darkness. Clara gasped, but she didn't stop. She kept walking, blind, leaning into the wind, Jonah's heartbeat trembling against her coat. Then Clara. Her head jerked toward the voice. Elias. His silhouette appeared through the snow, charging toward them, legs cutting through drifts as if the storm had no right to slow him. When he reached them, he didn't hesitate. He pulled Jonah from her arms, clutching the boy tight against his chest. His breath shook, not from cold, but something deeper, raw, cracked open. "You shouldn't have gone out there," he said, voice breaking. "You could have, both of you." Clara swayed on her feet, barely staying upright. "He was alone," she whispered. "He went after his toy. I couldn't let him. I couldn't leave him." Elias stared at her. For the first time since she'd met him, fear, not anger, not frustration, shone plainly in his eyes. Fear of losing something he couldn't bear to lose. He wrapped one arm around Clara to steady her and guided both of them back to the cabin. Shielding them from the wind with his own body. Inside, he set Jonah near the fire, rubbing the boy's cold hands between his own until color crept back into his skin. Jonah leaned into him, still shaking, still clutching the wooden horse Clara had nearly died retrieving. Elias didn't move for a long time, didn't speak, just held the boy, forehead resting lightly against Jonah's hair. Clara stood nearby, dripping snow, her limbs trembling, watching a man she thought was made of stone soften into something painfully human. Finally, Elias looked up at her. The fire lit his face, the worry carved deep, the relief deeper still, the gratitude he didn't yet know how to speak. Clara swallowed hard, unable to hold his gaze for more than a second without her heart tightening in her chest. Elias turned back to Jonah, settling beside the bed as the boy drifted into exhausted sleep. He didn't leave his side, not even when the first pale light of dawn crawled over the frozen horizon. And Clara, standing in the dim cabin, understood. Something had cracked open in Elias Boone that night, something no storm had ever touched before. The storm passed by morning, leaving the world glazed in white. Snow sat deep against the fence line, soft as wool, and the sky above the ranch shone a brittle blue, clean after the night's fury. Clara stepped outside with a pail of warm water, watching her breath billow like smoke in the still air. Her limbs ached, her hands were raw, but she stood taller than she had since arriving at Dry Creek Ranch. Jonah lived. She had carried him through a storm strong enough to peel paint off a barn. She had saved him. And though she would never say it aloud, something inside her glowed with a quiet, unexpected pride. Elias emerged from the cabin a little later, moving stiffly after a night spent hunched beside Jonah's bed. His face was drawn, but when he saw Clara standing near the porch steps, he paused. He didn't thank her, not in words. But the way he looked at her, that was more than enough. By late morning, a horse approached from the direction of town. Clara noticed first, shielding her eyes against the sun. It was Reverend Alcott the preacher from Pine Hollow, his black coat buttoned up to his chin, hat tied with a cord so the wind wouldn't claim it. Elias met him in the yard, jaw tightening the moment he saw the man. "Reverend," he said, voice neutral, "Mr. Boone." The preacher greeted, breath fogging the cold air. "A word, if you've got a moment. It concerns reputation." Elias didn't answer, which the preacher took as permission to continue. "The town is uneasy," Alcott said, lowering his voice, though no one but Clara stood within earshot. "There's talk about the girl, about her staying here, alone, with you." He cleared his throat. "The church fears such gossip may cast shadows on its standing." Elias stared at him. "The church," he repeated, "is worried about gossip." The Reverend's expression tightened. "Immorality spreads quickest when appearances give reason for suspicion." Clara froze, hands trembling around the pail. The preacher went on. "Mrs. Granger sent this." He extended a folded letter, sealed with wax. "She expects the girl returned immediately. She claims you've kept her beyond what was intended." Elias didn't open it, didn't read a single word. He tore it clean in half, then into quarters. Snow caught the scraps and carried them off like feathers. The preacher startled. "Elias." I know what it was," Elias said, voice flat as winter stone, "and it doesn't change a thing." "You're making this difficult," Alcott warned. "People talk." Elias. "They'll ruin her." Elias's gaze hardened. They already tried. A long silence settled between them, colder than the snow underfoot. Without another word, the preacher mounted his horse and rode off, coat flapping behind him like a black flag retreating. Clara stood near the barn, heart pounding. She hadn't meant to listen. But the words clung to her ruin, appearances, immorality, all so familiar, from years spent beneath whispered judgment. Yet Elias had torn the letter, torn it without a second thought. She watched him now as he walked back toward the barn, snow crunching under heavy boots. The wind tugged at his coat, but he didn't seem to notice. Something was shifting in him, something she wasn't sure he even recognized. Yet, later that afternoon, Clara returned to a saddle she'd been repairing. It was an old thing, stiff leather, stitching rotted, girth strap, torn clean through. No hand in Pine Hollow had bothered with it. Too time-consuming, they'd said, too ruined to fix. But Clara saw something salvageable. She warmed the leather, coaxing it back to suppleness. She cut new stitching by lantern light, her needle moving with the steady precision of someone who'd mended things her whole life. Aprons, seams, wounds no one else could see. When she finished, the saddle looked almost new. Not perfect, she didn't trust perfection, but sturdy, strong, functional, something a man could ride into winter with. Elias stepped into the barn just as Clara set the saddle down. He stopped mid-stride. "You fixed that?" he asked. She nodded. Thought it might still have some miles in it. He approached, running his hand over the new stitching. His fingers paused over each repaired seam, each careful knot. The admiration on his face was subtle but unmistakable. "That's better work than the saddler in town," he murmured. "A damn sight better." Clara's cheeks warmed. No one had ever looked at her work like that before, not with respect, not with genuine appreciation. Elias lifted the saddle easily, testing its weight. "You got a gift," he said, eyes still on the leather. "A good one." Clara swallowed. "Just something I know how to do." "That," Elias said softly, "makes it worth more." Their eyes met just for a breath, a flicker of connection, deep and quiet as a sigh. Then Clara looked away, pretending to adjust the lantern. Night fell gentle that evening. The wind had softened. Snowflakes drifted instead of stung. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, warm enough to thaw the sting of the morning's gossip. Elias sat at the table, oiling a pair of reins. Clara mended a glove by the fire. Jonah slept in the corner, wrapped in a quilt. After a while, Elias set down the reins. "Clara," he said, the name low, almost hesitant. She glanced up. "I want you to stay," he said simply, "at least through the winter. Jonah, he likes you. And the ranch," he cleared his throat, "needs hands that don't break things." Clara's breath stilled. "Stay." A word too heavy and too soft at the same time. "I don't know what people will say," she whispered. "They've been saying things their whole lives." Elias answered. "Stay anyway." The fire popped. Jonah shifted in his sleep. Snow fell soft against the windows. Clara stared at her hands, twisting the thread around her fingers. She began. But her voice faded. She wasn't ready to answer, not yet. And Elias waited. For the first time in years, he didn't push, didn't demand. He simply sat there, hands folded, breathing steady, as if he could weather the uncertainty as easily as the storm. Clara looked toward the window, watching the snow drift down like quiet blessings. She didn't know what she wanted, but for the first time in her life, she knew what she didn't want. To leave. The thought scared her more than the storm, and warmed her more than the fire. The sun hadn't even cleared the ridge when trouble rode in. Clara was feeding Jonah warm oats at the kitchen table, her fingers still stiff from the morning cold, when she heard hooves, too many to be friendly, and the crunch of wagon wheels grinding against frozen dirt. Jonah's spoon froze midair. Even he sensed something wrong. Elias stepped out onto the porch first, boots thudding, the cold air turning his breath into smoke. Clara moved behind him, just inside the doorway, close enough to see, but far enough to hide if she needed. Down by the ranch gate, a small procession had gathered. Mrs. Granger, 3 girls from the sewing house, and Deputy Roy Henders, sitting tall in the saddle, badge glinting in the pale morning light. Clara felt her stomach twist. Mrs. Granger stepped forward, her fur-lined coat puffing around her like a hen ready for a fight. The girls flanked her, smirking the way only the young and cruel knew how. "Mr. Boone," Mrs. Granger called, voice sharp as cold iron. "We're here for the girl." Elias didn't move. "State your business." The matron sniffed as though the very air offended her. "Clara Mayfield has been living under your roof for weeks, alone, unsupervised, in the presence of a child who is not her kin." Jonah shrank behind Clara's skirt. Mrs. Granger went on, louder now. "It is indecent, it is immoral, and it must end today." One of the girls, Lydia, the ringleader, lifted her chin. "Everyone in town knows she's staying here. Folks are talking. Mr. Boone, they say she's corrupting your household." Another snickered. "What else would a girl like her do? Eat you out of house and home?" The third chimed in, laughing under her breath. "If she sits on your chairs much longer, they'll snap clean in half." Clara felt her face burn. The wind cut against her cheeks, but the words cut deeper. Deputy Henders cleared his throat. "Mr. Boone, I've been asked to escort Miss Mayfield back to Pine Hollow. She's under the care of Mrs. Granger's establishment, and town ordinance says no." Elias said it without raising his voice, but the sound of the word flat, final hung in the cold air long after it left his mouth. Mrs. Granger stiffened. "Excuse me, she stays," Elias said. "She works. She harms no one." The girls exchanged looks. Then Lydia laughed outright. "You're serious, Mr. Boone. She's a joke. Everyone knows that. You're keeping her because Elias stepped off the porch. The sound of his boots on the snow cracked through the yard like a shot. Even the horses shifted nervously. He walked until he stood between Clara and the entire crowd, his broad shoulders blocking her from sight. "You think she's a joke?" His voice was low, steady. "You think that makes you clever?" The girls smirked. Elias's jaw flexed once. Then he raised his voice, not yelling, not roaring, but booming, the kind of sound a man makes when he has been silent too damn long. "You don't know strength," he thundered, "when it's standing right in front of you." The words rolled across the ranch like thunder. "You don't know what it is to wake before dawn and work till your hands bleed. You don't know what it is to save a child's life in a storm that would have killed any one of you in 5 minutes. You don't know what it is to keep going when the world tries to break you every step of the way." He turned slightly, just enough for the crowd to see Clara behind him. "But she does. Clara does. And you come out here calling her a joke," Lydia tried to laugh, but it came out weak. Mrs. Granger recovered first. "Mr. Boone, emotional nonsense aside, she must return. She is a ward of my house." Clara's breath faltered. Her hands gripped the doorway until her knuckles went white. Elias didn't look away from the matron. "She's not livestock to be fetched. She's a free woman. She chooses where she goes." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "Elias, the town's expectin'. I don't give a damn what the town expects." Elias snapped. The deputy blinked, not used to being cut off. Mrs. Granger drew herself up. "Then I demand to hear from the girl herself." Clara froze. All eyes fell on her. The wind kicked up, stirring her skirt, brushing snow across her boots. She stepped onto the porch, breath stuttering in the cold. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I'm not," she swallowed. "I'm not living in sin. I'm working. that's all. One of the girls laughed. Working. More like weighing down the place. Enough, Elias growled, turning on them so fast they flinched. But Mrs. Granger was relentless. Clara Mayfield, do you intend to remain here, in defiance of respectable society? Do you intend to embarrass this town? Clara's knees trembled. Those words, embarrass and respectable, were stones thrown at her for years, stones that left bruises beneath the skin. Her eyes met Elias's. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She straightened slowly, just an inch, just enough. I don't intend to shame anyone, she whispered, but I won't go back with you. Mrs. Granger's lips tightened. Then you leave me no choice. Deputy Wu, but the deputy didn't move. No one did. All eyes were on Elias, waiting. Snow drifted softly through the silence. Elias stepped closer to Clara, just enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her back. She stays, he said, voice steady, unshakable. Mrs. Granger inhaled sharply, readying another volley. But before she could speak, Clara felt something shift in the air. Tension thickened. Lines were being drawn, and her world was about to change again. The wind quieted. The ranch held its breath, and Clara, shivering on the porch, realized this fight was far from over. The cold was biting enough to sting skin. But the only thing Clara felt in that moment was the weight of every stare fixed on her. Mrs. Granger stood, ramrod straight at the gate, the three girls behind her smirking like cats waiting for a mouse to bolt. Deputy Henders shifted from boot to boot, uncomfortable, trying to pretend he wasn't part of the spectacle. And Elias? Elias stood between Clara and all of them, a wall of quiet fury and unspoken loyalty. Yet even with him there, she felt small, smaller than she had in years. Small the way she had felt as a child, ridiculed in hallways, whispered about at church, dismissed in sewing shops, ignored in crowds. Speak, girl. Mrs. Granger snapped. Do you stay or do you leave, girl? Not Clara. Not a worker. Not even a person. Just a thing to be ordered and returned like borrowed cloth. Clara felt her hands shake. Her breath came shallow. Jonah's small grip on her skirt reminded her she wasn't alone, but still the tremble wouldn't stop. The wind scraped across the snow-dusted yard, tugging at her shawl, teasing her hair loose from its ribbon. She swallowed hard. Her throat felt thick and dry. Elias turned halfway toward her, not touching her, but close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating off him, the warmth of someone who would stand with her, but couldn't speak for her. This choice had to be hers. Clara looked down at her hands. They were raw from work, skin split in places from the cold. She remembered how life had tried to make her small year after year, sneer after sneer. But she also remembered Jonah's small body clinging to her in the storm. She remembered the saddle she'd restored, the pride in Elias's eyes when he'd touched her stitching. She remembered standing in that blizzard, lantern shaking, but not turning back. She remembered surviving. She lifted her head. Her voice quivered. Mrs. Granger crossed her arms impatiently. Clara inhaled once, steadying herself from somewhere deep, somewhere sturdy. And when she spoke again, her voice didn't shake. I want to stay. Silence. A breathless, frozen silence that seeped into bone. The deputy's brow shot up. One of the sewing house girls gasped. Mrs. Granger's face went tight as a knotted thread pulled too hard. Even Elias seemed stunned, not because he doubted her, but because hearing her claim her place out loud felt like witnessing something rare and strong. What Mrs. Granger demanded. Clara's chin rose just a fraction, but enough. I want to stay, she repeated. Not because I'm forced. Not because I'm afraid of town, but because I choose to. Her voice carried softly, but firmly across the yard. Deputy Henders cleared his throat. Matron, she's of age. If she chooses to stay, no law says she must return with you. The matron spun toward him. This is a moral matter. Roy, maybe so, he muttered, but it ain't a legal one. Mrs. Granger sputtered, looking from Clara to Elias, indignation turning her cheeks blotchy. Behind her, Lydia murmured something cruel to the other girls. But their smirks faltered. They hadn't expected Clara to stand tall. Not today. Not ever. Clara stepped off the porch, her limp noticeable, but her spine straight. She walked until she stood just behind Elias's shoulder. Not hiding, not cowering, present, Mrs. Granger pointed at her sharply. You are making the gravest mistake of your life. Clara didn't flinch. It wouldn't be the first time people told me that. Elias watched her, eyes shadowed with something she couldn't name, something warmer than pride, deeper than relief. Mrs. Granger huffed, turned on her heel, and marched back to the carriage. The girls followed, though not one of them laughed this time. Their iciness melted into uncertainty under Clara's steady gaze. The deputy nodded once to Elias. You two take care of the boy. Then he nudged his horse away, leaving them in the quiet. When the last hoofbeat faded, the yard felt impossibly still. Elias let out a breath he'd been holding for far too long. He turned to Clara, voice softer than she'd ever heard it. You didn't have to do that, he said. Yes, she whispered. I did. His jaw tensed, not with anger, but with emotion he struggled to show. He scratched the back of his neck, looked toward Jonah, still at the doorway, wide-eyed, then back at Clara. If you stay, he began slowly. I want to ask something of you. Clara blinked, a knot of fear small, sharp, pressed against her ribs. Was this it? Was he about to ask her to leave anyway? For her own safety? Or worse, was he about to? But Elias surprised her. I want you to teach me, he said. She frowned. Teach you. What he held out a leather strap he'd been repairing stitches uneven. Pulled too tight in places, frayed where he'd miscut the edge. How to mend things, he murmured. I've been breaking them too long. Clara's throat tightened. Something warm rose up through her chest, up into her eyes. Not sorrow, not shame, but release. A letting go of years she'd carried alone. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. Elias's brow softened. I didn't mean no, Clara whispered, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. It's a good thing. She swallowed. It's the kindest thing anyone's ever asked of me. He didn't move toward her. He didn't reach for her. He just stood there, breathing steady, waiting. Clara looked at the leather strap in his hands, at the stitches she could already see how to fix, at the man who, little by little, was learning how to mend more than tack and tools. She nodded once, the tiniest smile touching her lips. I'll teach you. Elias exhaled relief, gratitude. Something deeper, and the tension in his shoulders eased. Behind them, Jonah slipped his small hand into Clara's. And for the first time, Clara didn't hide the way her eyes shined. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the quiet, heavy, expectant remained. Something was beginning, something neither of them dared to name. Winter didn't end all at once in Dry Creek. It melted slow, quiet as breath, patient as the years Clara had carried on her back. The blizzards eased first, then the wind softened, no longer snarling against the cabin walls. Snow still blanketed the ground, but now it glistened under a gentler sun. Not the cruel glare of storms. Life on the ranch shifted in small, steady ways. People in Pine Hollow, so loud in their judgment weeks earlier, grew strangely silent. It wasn't that they apologized. Folks in small towns rarely did, but the whispers dwindled. A few shopkeepers softened their tone when Clara came in for nails or flour. Mothers nodded politely. Men who had once smirked now looked away. Gossip is a fire it burns hot, then dies once it runs out of wood, and Clara had stopped feeding it. She moved through town with her chin a little higher. Limp still there, weight still there, scars still there, but none of it hidden, none of it shameful, because she had chosen something for the first time. And that choice grew roots under her feet. At the ranch, the changes were quieter, but deeper. Jonas smiled more. Not big smiles, just small ones, quick as flickers, the kind a boy gives when he finally feels safe enough to try. He followed Clara around like a shadow, mimicking her stitches with twine, carrying scraps of leather like treasure. Sometimes he tucked himself beside her when she worked, head resting against her arm, the two of them slipping into a rhythm not even winter could interrupt. Elias changed too, not all at once, not dramatically, just subtly. He worked slower, more mindful. Tools didn't fly across the yard anymore. Boards weren't split out of frustration. The old anger still lived in him. Years don't disappear overnight, but he learned to breathe through it instead of letting it break things. Once, when a nail bent wrong in his hand, Clara watched him start to curse, jaw tightening. Then he caught her eye, stopped, started again. Clara pretended not to notice, but her hands trembled slightly on the sewing needle, warmed by a pride she'd never known she had earned. About 3 weeks after the confrontation at the gate, Elias stood awkwardly near her work table, a strip of torn leather in one hand and a borrowed needle in the other. "Show me again," he muttered. Slow this time. "You're holding it wrong," Clara said gently, brushing her hair from her face. "Let the needle follow the leather, not fight it." Elias tried, pricked his own finger, hissed a curse, so soft it barely counted. Clara startled, then laughed, not politely, not shyly, a real laugh, warm, unguarded, sudden enough to break her own stillness. Elias froze. It was the first time he'd heard that sound from her, the first time she'd let the weight she carried slip long enough to feel unburdened. He looked at her as if the world had shifted under his boots. "Didn't mean to entertain you?" He grumbled. "You didn't," Clara said quickly, then smiled. "Well, maybe a little." Jonah giggled from the corner, mimicking Elias pricking his finger with exaggerated drama. Elias shook his head, but the corners of his mouth lifted a smile so faint only someone watching closely would notice. Clara noticed, and something inside her settled, like a quilt smoothed over tired shoulders. By the end of February, evenings in the cabin had a new pattern. Clara stitched by the window, lantern glowing gold across her hands. Jonah curled beside her with his tiny scraps of cloth, tongue peeking out in concentration as he tried to copy her stitches. Elias worked at the table, slow, careful attempts at mending harness straps, muttering under his breath every time the thread tangled. Sometimes he said nothing at all, content just to listen to the soft sounds of thread pulling through leather, Jonah's quiet huffs, Clara's breathing steady beside the window. If anyone had stepped in then, they might have thought this was how the cabin had always been warm, lived in, gently alive. They wouldn't have known about the years Elias sat alone by the fire. The silence so heavy, it felt like another man in the room. They wouldn't have known Clara once cried herself to sleep in a crowded sewing house attic, treated like a burden even by those who swore they sheltered her. They wouldn't have known Jonah used to wake screaming from nightmares only Elias heard. Now he slept soundly. Clara's lullabies, soft hums, more breath than song, held him deeper than blankets ever had. And Elias no longer paced the floor at night. He didn't stare at the empty chair across from him. He didn't drink hot coffee just to fill the silence. The silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It had weight, warmth, a heartbeat. One late winter evening, snow drifting lazy outside the window, Clara finished a small coat she'd sewn for Jonah, lined with wool, stitched with love she didn't dare name aloud. Jonah wriggled into it happily, spinning once, arms out like a bird trying to catch air. Clara laughed again. Elias stood in the doorway, shoulder braced against the frame, watching them. Not the way a man watches a scene, the way a man watches a home he never thought he'd have again. The fire crackled in the hearth. Clara brushed Jonah's hair from his forehead. Jonah leaned into her side, full of trust. Elias looked at them as though seeing color, returned to a world long winter faded. Clara noticed him then, framed by the doorway, snow clinging to his coat. She tilted her head. Something wrong. He shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on her, on Jonah, on the golden glow spilling across their faces. Then, with a soft click, he closed the door behind him, shutting out the cold. Reckon winter finally gave something back, he murmured. Clara's breath caught. Jonah pressed closer. The fire glowed brighter, as if it understood. In that quiet, in that warmth, all three of them felt it. The winter that had taken so much had finally returned something. Something small, something steady, something like a beginning. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it. In a snow-beaten barn, in a quiet kitchen, in the steady hands of someone who never believed they were worth noticing. Clara didn't change the world. She just kept showing up in it. One stitch, one breath, one choice at a time. And somehow, that was enough to mend a ranch, and the two hearts that lived there long before she ever arrived. Elias learned something too, that strength isn't the slam of a door or the crack of a fist. Sometimes, it's the softness you haven't let yourself feel in years. Sometimes, it's the courage to try again, even when you've spent half your life breaking things you meant to hold close. Jonah, small and quiet as winter light, found something he didn't have a name for, but he knew it felt warm and safe, and maybe that's the real lesson in their story, that none of us are defined by the cruelest things someone ever said about us, that gentleness can survive even the harshest winters, and that sometimes the family we think we've lost finds its way back in the most unexpected form. Thank you for spending this time with us, for letting this story sit beside you a while, the way an old friend might on a quiet winter night. Your presence here means more than you know. Every like, every share, every subscribe, they aren't just numbers. They're small acts of kindness, little sparks that help us keep these stories alive. Stories about dignity, gentleness, and the strength that grows in forgotten places. Thank you for being here with us. Every like, share, and subscribe helps us tell more stories that touch the soul. Until the next tale by the fire, stay warm, stay kind, and take care of your heart.